Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a sermon that looks at one of the most dramatic turnarounds you can imagine. We're talking about how a group of people went from witnessing a mind-blowing miracle to literally wishing for death, all in just a few weeks. Yeah, we're heading into the wilderness of Exodus.
So, just try to picture this for a second. You have just been miraculously freed from generations of slavery. You've literally walked through a parted sea. Divine power isn't just a belief, you've seen it. But now, just days later, you find yourself in a barren, unforgiving wasteland. There's no water, and the food you carried with you, well, it's all gone.
That, right there, was the voice of the Israelites not even a month after their incredible escape. I mean, it is just shocking. They're actually looking back fondly on the place of their enslavement, all because their stomachs were full. So how on earth did they get to this point of absolute desperation so quickly? Well, the thing is, this crisis wasn't just a single event. It was this series of relentless, escalating survival challenges. First, it's 3 days with zero water. Then, they finally find some, but guess what? It's bitter, basically poison. A month goes by, all the food is gone. And then, just to top it all off, they're out of water again. This kind of mounting pressure, it led to a very, very human reaction: complaining.
But the sermon we're analyzing makes a really key point here. The original text uses a word, yuanyan, which means so much more than just grumbling. We're talking about a deep, bitter complaint. This repeated yuanyan shows this profound anxiety, this disconnect from the God who had just performed world-changing miracles to save them. It's a crisis of faith.
So the reaction to these bitter complaints is really where the story gets fascinating, because it reveals two vastly different ways you can approach hardship, one from the people and a totally different one from their leader, Moses. And here it is, the core distinction the sermon makes. You see, the people's response was complaint. It was focused on the problem, on what they used to have, and it was aimed right at Moses. It was accusatory. But Moses, his response was different. He cried out. He took that very same crisis, that same desperation, and he turned it toward God. It's the same problem, but a completely different direction. Complaint looks backward and sideways in blame. Crying out looks upward in trust. The speaker paints this picture of Moses as the classic person in the middle, right? He's absorbing all the pressure, all the fear, all the anger bubbling up from the people below. But instead of getting sucked into that cycle of blame with them, he redirects it. He channels it upward, taking their needs directly to God. It's a masterclass in handling pressure. So what about God's reaction? You know, we often have this image of an angry, vengeful God ready to smite anyone who dares to doubt. But the sermon points out that in these first few encounters in the wilderness, that is not what happens. Not at all. Instead of anger, God's response is just patience and provision. They complain about bitter water, he makes it sweet. They complain about having no food, boom, he sends manna from the sky. They complain about no water again, he brings it gushing from a rock. The sermon suggests God is acting like a patient parent with a child who's, new to the world and just doesn't get the bigger picture yet. But, and this is a really crucial point, this patience from God is all about context. Because later, in the book of Numbers, the people complain again, and this time God does respond with judgment. So the sermon asks, what changed? Well, by that point, they had received the law. They had a formal covenant, a clear understanding of their responsibilities. God's response evolved right alongside the people's level of accountability. And this leads to what might be the sermon's most powerful insight. See, with the food came a rule: only gather what you need for today. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a test, maybe a restriction, but the sermon offers a complete reframing of what a divine command actually is. I want you to forget the idea of a command as just a restrictive rule. The sermon argues that to really get it, we should look all the way back to the story of creation in Genesis, because there, every single command was creative. Think about that pattern, right? A command like, let there be light, wasn't a restriction. It was a creative act. It brought order out of chaos, potential out of nothingness. The sermon's point is that these kinds of commands, they aren't meant to limit life. They're meant to create the very conditions for life to thrive in the first place. So when God told them to only gather enough manna for one day, it wasn't some test designed for them to fail. No, it was an invitation. It was a creative command designed to bring order to their anxiety. It was a daily lesson in trusting that, hey, provision will be there again tomorrow. It was meant to free them from the chaos of hoarding and fear.
because the real journey here wasn't just physical. You can get out of Egypt, but Egypt can still be in you. You can be physically free, but still be mentally enslaved to all those old ways of thinking, to fear, to self-interest, and to a default setting of complaint.
So the ultimate takeaway from this sermon is this choice. In any tough situation, any wilderness we're in, we can let ourselves get trapped in the mindset of complaint, which just leads to stagnation and despair, or we can transform that same energy into a cry for help, an act of hopeful reliance that opens the door for real transformation and actually moves us forward. And we don't have to make that choice alone. The sermon reminds us that we should find and really appreciate those people. You know, the mentors, the friends, the leaders who act as our Moses. They're the ones who listen to our struggles, absorb our anxieties, and help point us upward toward a solution instead of just sideways in blame.
This ancient story, it's not just about the past. It's a mirror for the modern wildernesses we all face. The pressures of a job, the anxieties of family, the challenge of just getting through the day. And in those moments, which voice do we default to?
That choice, the sermon suggests, determines everything. It is the difference between staying stuck in the desert of our problems or beginning the journey toward a promised, more flourishing future.